During the Vietnam War with China in 1979, it was common for Vietnamese women's guerrilla units to attack Chinese rear forces. They were ruthless, but two Vietnamese women defied the system and spared the life of an enemy, though not out of noble intentions. During the war with Vietnam, China faced challenges with personnel reserves. The mobilized resources were there, but the recruits lacked military skills. 1 month of training was not enough to prepare strong soldiers. So, inexperienced recruits were sent to support roles where young men organized supplies of material and technical resources to the front. They became easy targets for Vietnamese women's guerrilla units. Fearless Vietnamese women would attack these rear headquarters, destroying everything in their path: supplies, humanitarian aid, medicine, equipment, ammunition, and soldiers. They left no one alive, chasing down even those who dropped their weapons and tried to flee in panic. The women showed no mercy to those who tried to surrender. Compassion for the enemy was not part of their code. But one day, the guerrilla fighters made an exception. They spared one of the men in the Chinese headquarters, even though he did not plead for his life. This brave man was named Huang Ganrong from the southeastern Chinese province of Yunnan. At the time of the war, he was 18 and had volunteered for the front. He was responsible for repairing military equipment and transporting wounded soldiers, ammunition, and fuel. Two Vietnamese women from the guerrilla unit captured him and took him with them. The journey was long. Huang tried to escape a couple of times, but he knew the terrain less well than the guerrilla women, so he was quickly recaptured. Exhausted after the battle, Ganrong was sure that the next day would be his last. But the Vietnamese women had different plans. They took him with them for other purposes. During the journey, Huang realized that they had separated from their unit. Even though his hands and eyes were bound, his hearing was sharp. From the conversations between the two women who had captured him, he understood that they had deserted. The guerrilla fighters were seriously discussing the decision to live in the forest because they were tired of the war and they needed Ganrong for carnal purposes. They chose Huang because they were attracted to his appearance. He was indeed a strikingly handsome man, something that had been noted since his childhood. As he grew older, his attractiveness increased. Chinese artists often invited him to pose for their paintings, generously rewarding him for his modeling. Huang was also very popular with women. Admirers seemed to appear out of nowhere, asking him to marry them, even when he was still very young. For several days, Ganrong traveled deep into the forest, accompanied by the two Vietnamese women. The final destination of their journey was a hut made of bamboo and leaves that the women had built. There, they fed him, gave him water, and allowed him to rest after the long road. The next day, however, Huang faced grueling labor, the real reason he had been taken captive. He was expected to share a bed with each of his captors in turn. Initially, he tried to escape, pretending he needed to use the toilet. But unfamiliar with the terrain and fauna, he encountered a poisonous snake that bit him. The intoxication made Huang lose consciousness. The same Vietnamese women found him. They promptly provided first aid, applied poultices, and nursed him back to health. For several days, he was cared for by one of the women named Ping. During his recovery, Huang grew closer to her and began to fall in love with her. He eventually accepted his fate, and soon Ping gave birth to his child. This life continued for 13 years until one day, while walking around the area, Ganrong discovered a bottle with Chinese writing on it. He realized he was not far from the border. He began studying the terrain, and when his captors let their guard down, he escaped. It took him several days to flee. Huang made it back to China and returned to his hometown, where he had long been presumed dead. The former captive shared his story with his family and the police. Although his life in captivity had felt like torture, he regretted until the end of his days that he never saw either his child or Ping, whom he had grown to love deeply, ever again. Also, watch the video about the largest great white sharks in history, or why people in the North prefer living in metal containers.